Now my mouth feels really dry. You gonna feed it to me too?
I need to.
Hey guys, it's Joe and Ryan, and today we're gonna talk about the different branches of astrology.
Branches of astrology.
Branches of astrology.
So by branches, what we mean is sort of different ways to apply astrology within different contexts. I'm gonna venture a guess and say that 100% of people that have been interested in astrology have gotten their feet wet with astrology or first introduced to it through what's called natal astrology, which is the astrology of birth charts. You know, usually we hear about astrology as a thing and we look more into it and we're like, hey, I know my date, time, and place of birth. I'll punch it into this calculator thing and it'll tell me my chart. And that's natal astrology, any kind of astrology that's based off of interpreting that birth chart within the context of a person's life.
But there are a whole bunch of other different kinds, not just natal astrology. Astrology can do a lot more than tell you about your life and your personality. One that's kind of related to natal astrology, and probably is the second most familiar to people, is predictive astrology. This is what you get into when you take a look at your year ahead, like your secondary progressions or transits or any other number of timing techniques, and see kind of what themes that year holds for you or what might be coming up in your future.
Another popular exercise with natal astrology is sort of the combination of two natal charts in what's usually referred to as synastry or relational astrology. Relational is sort of the more umbrella term because there are other non-synastry
kind of ways
methods that you can look at the relationship between two individuals. A lot of times this is used more for like compatibility between two individuals, most often within like a romantic setting because we're all, 16-year-olds at heart. True story. And it's just the way of seeing like how one person's natal placements sort of line up with another person's natal placements and what that means for their ability to interact with one another.
There's also composite charts where you take two charts and kind of combine them together. It's kind of complicated and there are different ways you can do this, but it's another way of evaluating the relationship between two people and their charts to see how compatible they are, to see how they'll get along or not, or interact.
But going beyond natal charts, because they're not the only thing in the world for astrology, which may be news for some individuals, they definitely get the focus a lot because everybody's sort of aware of them and everybody has a birth time, or, everybody was born. But there's more to astrology than just natal charts. One of the more interesting branches is horary astrology, which is based off of asking specific questions and getting back answers or insight into those questions from a astrological chart that was constructed at the time of the question or the time that the astrologer understood the question. I actually remember being really upset when I first was learning astrology. My first astrology book had this kind of thing like talking about different kinds of astrology, and it mentioned horary astrology, and I just thought it was super fascinating, and I was always really sad that not always, but I was really sad because I was like, I'm never going to get to learn this, and it was like, it's really heart-wrenching, but then I did, and it was fine, so take that book.
Happy ending. Ryan is literally a horary astrologer now. I remember when I heard about horary, listen, especially way back in the day, I was really into the woo-woo stuff, and astrology was that for me, but I loved it. I was like, wow, it's so mystical. But hearing about horary astrology, I was like, because here's the idea. Let's say I lost my keys, and I was like, Ryan, I lost my keys. Can you help me find them? Once I say that to Ryan and Ryan's like, Joe needs to find her keys, he'll cast a chart, an astrology chart, like a birth chart, for that moment, like the birth of the question. And in that chart will be the answer, like literally where my keys are at. And it's just like, it seems really wild. It even seemed wild to me. All of that to say, it seemed wild to even me. But it's super accurate and it's really fascinating. And I didn't even know astrology could really do that. And even when I heard it could, I kind of didn't believe it.
Yeah, it's
until I got a horary consultation done for a question I had, and it was just like, hit every nail on the head. So it's really fascinating that astrology can do that.
It's definitely kind of out there as an idea, it's almost like you can accept the idea that astrology can be used to give some sort of insight into an individual's life. But then you're you mean it can help me answer specific questions? And that just kind of gets a little weird, kind of like you said. And a lot of times it can come across as kind of like a parlor trick, would astrology really care that I lost my keys? It's
apparently it does. If you care enough to ask, astrology cares enough to answer, generally with horary. So another kind of astrology, or another way you can use astrology, is with electional astrology. And this is when you look at where the planets are at what time to try to pick the best time to do something, like get married, or take a trip, or start a new job or sell your house, something like that.
It's a little bit more interesting because it's more of a sort of direct application of astrology. You know, a lot of times, like a lot of astrology is more just like kind of passive, you know? It just kind of happens like somebody's born and then you read the chart. Or like somebody asks a question and then you read the chart and you're kind of just stuck with that chart in a sense. Like, you know, that's just it and you read it and that's that. But with elections, it's much more participatory. You get to like make the chart and, you know, find things that you like about a chart and find things that you don't like and kind of, you know,
try to maximize the good and minimize the bad. And this is interesting because on discussion boards and stuff, you'll see people have discussions about like, what would be your perfect natal chart? Like, what would be the best thing? Yeah. And what's funny is like, that's electional astrology. Is like picking a natal chart for a thing you're going to do. Like, if you're going to start a business, you want it to have a good birth chart sort of idea. And that's what you're doing when you're doing electional astrology, is trying to maximize good placements that are in alignment with what you want to accomplish and minimize anything that would hinder that. So you can totally use astrology to do that with really good results.
Another sort of related idea is astrological magic, which is a sort of like the applying electional astrology type ideas to the commencement of religious ritual to get a certain result.
Right, and with astrological magic, you are using a lot of the same kind of electional rules with some differences regarding placements, but it's also a way of like engaging with, like you were saying, the more spiritual side of astrology. Like, you can elect a time using kind of electional principles to do a Venus ritual to connect with the planet Venus and align yourself with that energy or with that spirit, and in doing so have a better relationship with that energy and have it manifest better in your life. There's kind of that side of it as well.
So a different I start talking to him like, oh, never mind.
So a different way of
applying she keeps
astrology.
making me do these videos and I just can't. So another application of astrology that is less like a branch and a little bit more like another trunk is medical astrology, or just the application of astrology for different medical purposes. And the reason why I characterize it that way is just that it's sort of a more pervasive shift in perspective, almost. Like, it's almost like a whole other system that you have to learn.
What do you mean?
Well, it's just like you can take astrology, like you can take Saturn as like a planet, and it has core themes that it expresses itself kind of consistently throughout all of astrology. So you're focusing less on Saturn as a rejecting and exclusive force to being like, Saturn means these things specifically within a medical context. You know, it's your spleen, it's, you know, it does these things to the body.
I see what you're saying.
So it's it's just like a more like microscopic focus on what Saturn does within the body or to the body, as opposed to to your to life or like within a chart.
I think that makes sense because it's just like Saturn has these significations if you're just looking at a chart, but like it has very specific ones that are very related to the body when you do medical astrology.
Because you're sort of focusing in on these more specific meanings of the planets and their interactions with one another, it kind of becomes its own thing. And so you have like medical horary, where you're asking questions about illnesses or about medical procedures. You have like medical elections, where you're picking times to like do surgery or like to start new medications. Of course, there's like medical natal, you know, if you want to like look at your natal chart within like a more, you know, medical focus, that's obviously a thing.
Right, like it's such a specific context that you can, that's why you're saying like trunk rather than branch, because it's like on this trunk, you can have some of the branches that we mentioned in that specific medical context.
All that to say,
medical astrology exists.
Yeah.
Another kind of astrology that you might actually be more familiar with than some of the ones that we mentioned is mundane astrology. And that's kind of the astrology of the world at large, or the astrology of countries and stuff like that. This is what you'll see people doing when they cover elections or
presidential elections.
Like presidential elections and I say elections and it's
not to be confused with like astrological elections.
Right. Political elections, things like that, and even going back farther in history to like countries splitting apart and like things like that happening. It'll be the study of the astrology of the world. It's the people who are like, the U.S. is having its Pluto return soon.
That's a good point.
That's mundane astrology, right? The people who are like talking about Clinton's chart and Trump's chart, they're doing politically oriented astrology, but they're using natal astrology and predictive techniques and stuff like that. But when it's like the chart for a country or the rise and fall of technology, you know, over like a long period, or the development of technology related to like Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions or like the outer planet movements, stuff like that, that would be considered mundane astrology.
So those are the sort of the major branches branches of astrology that a student can focus on and study, you'll probably always find one that really kind of speaks to you more or that you're more interested in. There's sort of a historical progression where, to where it's sort of recommended that you learn horary first, and then elections, and then you can do magic if you're so inclined, and then natal astrology, and then mundane astrology. And that sounds kind of strange compared to the way
super weird
we
to me.
do it now, because we have such a big focus on natal astrology. But the reason why it's done this way is it's sort of a natural progression, because one of the things that you learn in horary is how to like focus in on something. Right. And like understand it and give information about it, and then you like kind of slowly back out. But horary teaches you kind of like the surgical strike, like how to get into a chart and how to like get the information that you're looking for out of it to be able to pull out and tell somebody. Elections are sort of like the next step where you make that happen. Like you're not looking at a chart to find what you want, you're looking at a chart to make it say what you want. Yes. And it's sort of like the next step. And then magic is that with a different focus,
to something
specific, with a more participatory attitude involved in it. And then you get to natal astrology, where you then apply those same like horary skills within a much more broader context. And you learn how to do different timing techniques to make predictions about a life, something much more general than time consuming. A life is time consuming.
It's pretty time consuming.
It takes up more time. And then eventually you go into mundane astrology. So it's just like this progression of skill level that we don't really have anymore in contemporary times because of the big focus on natal astrology and how pervasive that has become as a phenomenon. So
that was a big shock to me. Like, Ryan's the first person that ever told me that, like, a while ago. Like, did you know traditionally horary was taught first? And I was like, why? Because I was like, natal astrology is the most relevant thing ever. And like, side note, I love natal astrology. Ryan hates natal astrology, and I don't understand. But so I was really surprised to learn this. But when I started studying horary a little bit, I really saw why that should come first in a way. It's not to say like drop everything.
Yeah, go learn horary.
Enroll in a horary course. Do not do any more natal.
Do it.
I can really see why that would be recommended, because a friend of ours in one of his lectures recently said, you know, it really bugs me when people say, this means this in horary. Because, like, no, it just means that this means that, period. You have to have context to know, like, why you're asking a certain question or evaluating a certain placement. But this means this no matter what. And when you study horary astrology, it really laser focuses you in on how to say, you know, where are my keys? You find the planet that represents the keys, and then you drill into that, and you drill into all the other details about that thing, because that's what you're looking for and evaluating. And it teaches you how to really dig and delve and flesh out a placement. You do that in natal astrology too. You just learn those concepts so thoroughly when you start with horary. But that said, you don't have to, but it would certainly supplement your practice if you're into natal astrology or something like that. That's how it was done back in the day.
Recommend 1010 would recommend.
I would also recommend it. I would.
That's how I learned.
That is how Ryan learned. Ryan's one of the rare few who did not start with like natal astrology completely.
I was like, natal astrology, horary.
Who wants to know about themselves?
That sounds neat.
Ryan was like, where's the lost cat? That's what he wants to know.
Everywhere here.
Well, he already found most of them, but give him a couple weeks.
I already found most of the lost cats.
He did. He might have to do natal soon, because you're running out of cats to find. So those are the major applications and branches of astrology that you may or may not have heard of or known about. They're all really fascinating. Like I said with horary, a lot of times learning more about one will supplement your studies with the other, so it's definitely worth exploring.
In the description of the video, we're going to put a bunch of different links to websites and book recommendations for these various branches, so if you're interested in any one of them, go and take a look. And if you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section below, and we'll get back to you. Stay tuned for next time.
Hopefully with more found cats. Always.
Don't taunt me.
Always. He'll do it anyway.